The last time anyone can recall having seen or heard from 32-year-old Nicole, or Nikki Fitts, was April 1st, 2016. And oddly enough, the last time anyone can recall having seen Nicole's 2-year-old daughter, Arianna, was about a month and a half earlier, sometime in mid-February. Both Nikki and Arianna were reported missing by concerned family members with the San Francisco Police Department on April 5th, 2016. However, only 3 days later, on April 8th, Nikki Fitts' body was discovered by an employee of the city's Parks and Recreation Department, buried in a shallow grave in John McLaren Park, which has an unfortunate reputation for being a body dump. Nikki was in a fetal position. The grave itself was not covered with dirt, but rather a piece of plywood that had a strange symbol spray painted in gray on it. I have posted a picture of the plywood, as its image has been released to the media in an effort to find anyone who might recognize it or know where it came from, because it is believed to have not come from anywhere within the park. Investigators have theorized that whoever placed Nikki in that shallow grave brought this plywood with them and placed it on top of her remains. So now they have found Nikki. The only real clue they have is this odd piece of plywood. And there is still one huge mystery that to this day hasn't been solved. Where in the world is Arianna Fitts? The park was scoured for any sign of the toddler, to no avail. Only Mom's remains were found. The information out there about this case is limited, but what the investigation hasn't covered, we will discuss here for this bonus episode of California Dreaming, The Disappearance of Arianna Fitts. Nikki Fitts was struggling at the time that she and her 2-year-old daughter Arianna were last seen. She had an older daughter whom she lost custody of to the father and was fighting to not only visit her any free weekend she had, because she was not close by, but rather in Southern California, while Nikki lived near San Francisco, but she was also fighting to regain custody. Those who knew Nikki would say that no matter how tough things got, she was always able to manage a smile, even if there was a great deal of heartache and strife going on behind it. And the most important things in the world to Nikki were her children. Nikki had gotten a job working at a Best Buy, but it was hardly enough to be able to afford to live in San Francisco. So she would end up taking extra shifts at the Best Buy, picking up overtime whenever she could in order to make ends meet. Nikki spent her days and nights working, and the nights that she had off, she searched for an affordable place for herself and her daughter. And in order to keep those long hours, Nikki relied on a full-time babysitter named Helena Hearn. And in case there was an occasion when Helena wasn't available to sit for Arianna, her sister, Ciolo Hearn, would step in to help. They were a lifesaver for Nikki, and she trusted them. So much so, she sometimes left Arianna to stay with them overnight so she wouldn't have to disrupt Arianna's sleep schedule. I will circle back to the babysitters in a few minutes. I want to back up a little bit more and talk about Nikki's life leading up to meeting the Hearn sisters and having them babysit for some pretty long hours for her. As I had mentioned, there is not a great deal of information out there about this case, and some of the details are a little bit sketchy because it is so mysterious. But San Francisco Weekly had a really great article on Nikki and Arianna entitled "Where is Arianna Fitts?" written by Nuala Bashari on July 26, 2018. It is strongly believed that the person who killed Nikki is the same person who kidnapped Arianna, and it is strongly believed that Arianna is still alive somewhere. And at the onset, the investigation was going strong in looking for the missing toddler. All of the various branches of the San Francisco Police Department were working together to try and find her. Homicide was on the case, as was the Special Victims Unit and Missing Persons. Their resources were combined because Arianna and Nikki's cases had elements that required all of their expertise. But then public interest began to wane. As the family continued searching for an answer as to what happened to Arianna and who killed her mother, the San Francisco Police Department had become embroiled in controversy. There was a spattering of fatal shootings involving police officers. There were protests, and there was the call for the police chief at the time to step down. In the shadow of all this scandal with the police department, Arianna's story sadly dropped out of the headlines. But for now, I want to go back and talk a little bit more about Nikki and her background and what it was that brought her up to the Bay Area. She was raised down here in Southern California along with two sisters. Nikki was the middle child, all being brought up by their mother on her own. For a time, the family of four moved around kind of frequently until they finally settled down roots in Culver City, a town pretty close to the Los Angeles International Airport and is also known for having a storied history in film and television. And from early on in life, as Nikki got into her teenage years, it seemed as though she was headed towards a bright future. Whatever it was that she was going to settle on doing in life, it was clear that she wanted to work with people and children, possibly even becoming an educator someday. She had donated her free time working as a community volunteer, something that she was very proud of. And according to Nikki's family, it was very common for her to go above and beyond whenever she could for the people that she cared about. She had a big heart and was very much a giver. But all of that changed when the three girls lost their mom before any of them reached adulthood. In the wake of their mother's passing, they were no longer going to be able to be kept together, each one of them having been placed in a different home. But despite that, the girls made it a point to stay in contact and make sure that no matter how much time passed or how far apart they'd be, they would never lose touch. And they didn't. So in 2012, Nikki, along with one of her sisters and a third friend, decided to pool their resources and get a place together in a town about 15 miles or 24 kilometers outside of San Francisco called Pacifica. San Francisco is notoriously expensive to live in, so this was a place that was just close enough, but still within their price range, just barely. Nikki had already one daughter by that time from a man back down in Southern California, and the move north was kind of like a new start for everyone. But despite the positive outlook and trying to keep their eyes on a bright future, the cost of living in the Bay Area was crushing. And before long, Nikki was expecting her second child, which would be Arianna, and that only compounded the financial woes. Nikki, her sister, and their friend had to face it. They could no longer afford this place. Nikki's sister and her friend found a place in Santa Cruz, California, and Nikki, she did what she could to try and make it work for herself in San Francisco, but she ended up having to take refuge in a women's housing facility. Child Protective Services stepped in and removed her daughter from her custody and sent her to live with her dad, hundreds of miles away in Southern California. And it was while Nikki was in between living situations that she met a woman named Lamasani Briggs. She was one of those types that walks the streets talking to random people that she passes about God and the Bible. She was at the women's shelter doing this sort of street evangelizing when she and Nikki met. And before long, they became friends, and soon she offered to rent a room in her place to Nikki. And by the time Nikki had moved in, she had already given birth to Arianna, and things were kind of on an upswing for her. She had a roof over her head, she had landed a new job working at Best Buy, and Lamasani also helped out with providing childcare for Arianna while Nikki was at work, for which she did compensate her for on top of chipping in for the rent. But for some reason, after a few months of this arrangement, it didn't really seem as though it was going to be working out as well as Nikki had thought it was. I'm not clear as to what happened between Lamasani and Nikki, and from the article in the San Francisco Weekly, it sounds like maybe she wanted to start charging Nikki more money for the rent and the childcare. And Nikki's sister would later speculate that Nikki started to think that perhaps Lemasani was asking for too much money and Nikki didn't think it was fair, or she couldn't afford any more than what she was paying. But whatever the case was, Nikki decided to find other childcare arrangements for Arianna. And she didn't have to look far. She ended up hiring the sitters that I mentioned earlier, Helena and Ciolo Hearn. And they are also related to Lemasani. She was their aunt, but they really weren't that close, which Nikki kind of thought it was a good thing because she was having her own falling out with Lemasani. So she didn't think it was going to be too much of a problem if she started having her nieces watch Arianna for her. The roommate that Nikki had lived with for that period of time in Pacifica told San Francisco Weekly that the arrangement with Lemasani's two nieces did not sit well with her at all. She did not think it was a good idea. If she had had a dispute with Lemasani, it would probably be best if she looked for childcare somewhere else. But, from what I've told you about Nikki's situation, she's working at Best Buy, and so the wages aren't livable, especially in the Bay Area. To look for licensed childcare that's affordable is next to impossible. It's almost not even worth getting up and going to work for, because all of your money goes right into the daycare. So I'm assuming that these nieces, Helena and Ciolo, are providing childcare at bargain basement prices. And it's a really difficult jam to be in, especially for a single mom. And her job at Best Buy was not full-time, so she was taking hours whenever she could get them. So after Nikki began sending Arianna to either Helena or Ciolo, the relationship with Lemasani began to sour even more. Could it have been because she started taking Arianna elsewhere for childcare, which ended up meaning less income for Lemasani? Possibly. So what she started doing instead was charging Nikki an exorbitant amount of money for rent. I don't know how much more she started demanding from Nikki, but it was amounting to be nearly her entire salary. Almost everything Nikki was earning was going to Lemasani for rent. And you know what else, which I found really puzzling? Lemasani never provided Nikki with her own set of keys to the place. If Lemasani wasn't home, then Nikki was out of luck. She would be locked out. Soon, Nikki's sisters began suspecting that the relationship between Nikki and Lemasani had turned volatile, just downright nasty. Lemasani began verbally abusing Nikki, just saying some really mean things to her, name-calling, just being abusive. Nikki also started to suspect that Lemasani was snooping through her things when she wasn't there, looking through her computer and in her diaries, just invading her personal space, and on top of everything else, it had just become too much. Finally, Nikki's sister had had enough. She came up from Santa Cruz. She got in touch with the San Francisco Police Department and requested a civil standby. She was going to Nikki's place of residence and she was going to collect her daughter, and all their stuff and bring them to live with her. So now Nikki was away from Lemasani, but Lemasani was not letting up. She continued to send messages to her, and according to what her sister told San Francisco Weekly, her texts were demanding for her to bring my baby back here. And that is one of the most jarring details of this case, knowing how Nikki's story comes to an end. And now Nikki is even further away from San Francisco, and when she goes to work, it's a total of 4 hours of commuting to make the round trip. The job at Best Buy was all she had. Sometimes she would end up spending the night at a friend's house who lived close by to the Best Buy, and that would mean Arianna would be with the babysitters oftentimes around the clock. And in the middle of all of this, Nikki was still trying to figure out a way to bring her older daughter back up to live with her again, to try and regain custody, as the dad had been given full custody. When Nikki had custody hearings, she would schedule days off so she could make that trip down to Southern California so she could be there in person. It was really important to Nikki that she provide for her children herself. But nobody at Best Buy was really on to the issues that Nikki was going through at this time. She was able to keep herself pretty well put together and never let on that anything was really amiss in her personal life, though some of her colleagues at Best Buy had an inkling that something was wrong because she was at the Best Buy a lot, prior to the start of her shift and in the hours after her shift. She never seemed to be in a hurry to leave work like most of us are. But the truth was, Nikki really had no place to go. And looking back, those who worked with her had wished that they had picked up on those little cues. It was just Nikki was proficient at keeping things about her private life private. Eventually, Nikki began opening up to her coworkers at the Best Buy, and one of them, named Goyette Williams, stepped up and said she and Arianna were more than welcome to stay at her place. This was a huge blessing for Nikki. She'd be able to have Arianna at home with her every night. She would be much closer to the Best Buy. It was the perfect arrangement for Nikki to get back on her feet. All she needed to do now was work out the childcare and she would be set. But there was a problem. The babysitters, Helena and Ciolo Hearn, were being really weird about giving Arianna back to Nikki. She had spent most of the first half of March of 2016 trying to get things in order and ready for them to move in with her soon-to-be roommate Goyette. I'm not clear as to how many nights out of the week Arianna was staying with either sister, but if Nikki was busy working extra hours and preparing to move in, it sounds like Arianna could have been spending almost every night away from her mother. So when Nikki called either Helena or Ciolo sometime in the middle of March to tell them that her new place was ready and she was coming for Arianna, they told Nikki, we're down in Southern California. We took a trip to go to Disneyland. Now, Nikki was very upset because they didn't even ask her if they could take Arianna on such a long trip. They didn't even tell her that they were going. So yeah, I'd be mad too. That's hundreds of miles away. And she was pissed, and rightfully so. But dreamers, truth be told, I don't think Helena and Ciolo took Arianna down to Disneyland. Most likely it was just a ruse to stall bringing Arianna back to her mother. And Nikki, she wasn't telling anyone that she was having trouble getting her daughter back from the babysitter. And this is why towards the beginning, I mentioned that Arianna had not actually been seen for nearly 2 months prior to Nikki's death. Her aunts hadn't seen her, and they really weren't sure now if Nikki herself had even seen Arianna. Now, I'm totally not blaming Nikki for any of this. It's not like we're talking about Casey Anthony here with her make-believe Zanny the Nanny, where clearly Casey was making up people, places, and things all over the place to cover for the fact that her daughter was actually dead. Nikki's circumstances here were very different. She had placed her daughter in what she had hoped were trusted hands out of necessity. She was offered affordable childcare. She had a tremendously long commute. She was couch surfing for the better part of the time leading up to all of this. But we know that she was trying her best to find a place to land and bring Arianna along with her. We really don't know the last time Nikki had actually laid eyes on her little girl. We don't know how long those sisters were making excuses and stalling. And that's because Nikki kept everything to herself. We've established that the last time anyone saw Nikki was April 1st, 2016. So what actually happened that day? Well, according to the timeline that San Francisco Weekly had laid out, it went a little something like this. Nikki had a shift at Best Buy, which she completed. After work, she was going to meet up with her ex-roommate with whom she had lived with in Pacifica, along with her sister. She was in San Francisco to interview for a potential job opportunity, but her plans had fallen through. So Nikki made plans to go shopping with a coworker from Best Buy. As the evening was winding down, Nikki wanted to stop and pick up some dinner for herself and Goyette, her new roommate, and she wanted to stop by a convenience store to withdraw some cash, a total of $600. Now this is the 1st of April, so maybe it was rent money for her to give to Goyette. That is just a guess on my part, as Nikki never specified to anyone what that money was for. There are other theories as to what the money was for, and we will come back to that. So when Nikki arrived home that night, she settled in with Goyette and they put on a movie. About an hour in, Nikki's cell phone rang. Goyette did not know who it was that called, but Nikki told her that she needed to go meet her babysitter at a nearby restaurant, that it shouldn't take any more than 5 minutes, and she'd be able to finish watching the movie when she got back. At some point, Goyette retired to bed because Nikki never showed back up that night. And when Goyette woke up the next morning, Nikki still hadn't come home. She also looked at her phone and saw that at some really bizarre hour of the night, Nikki had sent her a text message that said she was driving with Sam to Fresno. Goyette did not know of anybody Nikki knew named Sam, and she also wasn't exactly sure how she was getting to Fresno because Nikki did not own a vehicle. Then at 1:13 a.m. on the morning of April 2nd, 2016, there was a post made on Nikki's Facebook page that said, quote, "Spending time with my 3-year-old, need this break," unquote. What raised eyebrows about this post were 2 glaring mistakes. For one, her toddler, Arianna, was only 2.5 years old, not 3. And secondly, the word break was misspelled. Instead of using B-R-E-A-K as in taking a break, the person who typed the post spelled it B-R-A-K-E as in car brakes. And those who knew Nikki all said she was really good about her grammar, so it would be unusual for her to make this type of mistake. Then, over the course of the next 2 days, Nikki failed to show up for her shifts at the Best Buy. Nikki's roommate Goyette became concerned, and so did her coworkers at Best Buy, as did her sister, who immediately filled with worry as soon as she heard Nikki didn't go to work. Her job at Best Buy was so important to her, there was just no way she would blow off work. This was her lifeline. So Nikki's sisters got together and headed to San Francisco to try and figure out how it was she was headed to meet someone at a restaurant and then suddenly changed her plans to go to Fresno, and then the cryptic message on Facebook that she needed this break with her 3-year-old. None of this made any kind of sense. But when Nikki's sister found out about the large withdrawal that she had made the night before she disappeared, she started to draw her own conclusions as to what may have happened. Is it possible that whoever had Arianna was demanding that Nikki give them this certain amount of money and then they will give Arianna back? So thinking that would solve all of her problems with these people, Nikki left to go meet with them to pay them off and retrieve her daughter, but she was double-crossed, and the person not only got the money, but they kept Arianna too and did away with Nikki in the process. Would Nikki have been so easily fooled into a trap like this? Her sister seemed to think that she could very easily be tricked, because she had it in her mind that if she just did what they asked of her, she would be able to put this entire ordeal behind her. Nikki's sisters made their way over to the San Francisco Police Department to file the missing persons report, but it soon became clear that Nikki's disappearance was not a pressing matter for law enforcement. She's an adult. She can go missing if she wants to. Of course, seeing all the red flags here, we can be fairly certain that something more sinister than she can disappear if she wants to is actually going on here. But Nikki's sisters would not be deterred by the San Francisco Police Department's lack of interest. They would do their own investigation. And it didn't take long for them to begin to suspect Helena and Ciolo Hearn, Arianna's caregivers, as having something to do with their disappearances. And it wasn't so much what they were doing, but it was what they weren't doing. Nikki's sisters had set up a missing persons page on Facebook for her and started watching the activity. People were leaving comments and messages and well wishes. Everyone who knew Nikki and Arianna, there was genuine concern from everyone except Helena and Ciolo, the people who were Arianna's primary caregivers, who were supposed to have been as close to her as Nikki was. They had absolutely nothing to say about their disappearance. Nikki's sisters tried talking to the police again so they could provide them with what little information they had about their suspicions of Helena and Ciolo, but they had no other information beyond their names. They were able to find them on Facebook, and that was about the extent of it. Nikki's ex-roommate sent a friend request to Ciolo, which she accepted, and she next sent her a private message asking if she had any information about Nikki and Arianna, but Ciolo ignored the message. Nikki's sisters did not know where Ciolo and Helena lived. Well, sort of. They had gone with Nikki one time to drop Arianna off to be watched. They first went to Helena's house, but nobody was home. So they had been there at least once to both of their houses, and they retraced the route and they were able to remember where they were. They made note of the addresses and turned that information over to police, and then they just had to wait. On April 8th, 7 days after Goyette had last seen Nikki, after she had received that phone call and left to go meet someone at a restaurant, only 3 days after Nikki's sisters reported her missing, they received a call from the San Francisco detective working her case. They were asked to come down to the station. They had some information to share. And the sisters were like, oh, this is great. Only 3 days in and they've got a lead or even something better because they want to talk to us in person. So they're thinking they've uncovered some dirt on Helena and Ciolo. But their excitement was short-lived as they were informed by the detective that they found Nikki and she was not alive. The following day, a press release was issued by the San Francisco Police Department regarding Nikki's killing, and it was a homicide, but it was also a missing persons case, possibly a child abduction, since Arianna was not discovered with her mother and nobody had remembered seeing her since sometime in February. Because of Arianna's age and because foul play is considered a factor in her disappearance, the police department was going to have to keep most of the information close to the vest as they worked in trying to find the missing toddler along with the person or persons responsible for Nikki's death. Investigators began trying to track down any surveillance cameras that may have been located in close proximity to the park where Nikki was found to see if they could find any leads as to the manner in which she was brought there. Detectives also spoke to people close to Nikki, and they executed searches of both Ciolo's and Helena's residences with hopes of finding anything that could lead them to Arianna, but there was nothing. No sign of the toddler anywhere. And then the investigation uncovered some troubling information about Helena Hearn. Turns out she's actually a convicted murderer. Well, what do you know? Some 15 years earlier, on February 23, 2001, Helena, only 18 years old at the time, shot the father of her 2-year-old daughter, 20-year-old named Dante Hebron. The couple were living together in Daly City, California, with their child and another 4-year-old that Helena had from a previous relationship. So, doing the math, Helena had a child roughly at the age of 14 and then again at the age of 16. It is not clear what Helena did immediately following the shooting, but from the information I found, it appears that she fled the scene as Dante did not die right away. He was able to get himself over to a neighbor's place for help, at which time 911 was called. Dante was transported to San Francisco General Hospital, but he would later succumb to his injuries. I was only able to find one article about the case in the San Francisco Gate dating back to just a few days after the shooting, and it was reported that Helena was going to have a plea hearing a month later. She was looking at the possibility of as many as 50 years in prison because of the enhancement of using a gun in the killing. In the beginning, it looked as if Helena was denying involvement in the killing, and her mom, Helen Reed, went to the media proclaiming her daughter's innocence, but ultimately the case against her was strong, leading her to go on to plead guilty to what? I'm not sure, but based on her sentence, it was a much lighter charge related to the killing, and she would go on to serve 6 years in prison. So with this information, investigators began taking a hard look at Helena along with her sister, and both of them were unwilling to be fully cooperative with the investigation, and the statements that they did provide just weren't lining up. These women were looking very suspicious, but that's all that investigators had thus far, was suspicions. There was nothing definitive linking either one of them to Nikki's murder, nothing linking them to Arianna's whereabouts. So I mentioned earlier that when Nikki's body was discovered, a piece of plywood was lying on top of her. And on this piece of plywood, there were some spray painted markings. About a month and a half after Nikki's body was found, police held a press conference and released a photo of that piece of plywood, hoping that someone would possibly recognize where it had come from. I posted an image of this piece of plywood in our Facebook group, asking what the group members made of the drawing. And many of you said the same things that were being said on the Reddit thread related to this case. It looks like either the cartoon character Finn from Adventure Time, or possibly Batman, possibly a cat. Others have said it just looks like random spray paintings on a piece of scrap plywood. Many believe it has no bearing on the case, other than the fact that the killer used it to cover up Nikki's body, which, if they were in a hurry, would be easier to do than to shovel dirt or branches or whatever on top of her. Many think it's a red herring and a waste of time focusing on it instead of other important evidence and leads in the case. Also at that press conference, it was announced that Best Buy had offered up a $10,000 reward for any information leading to the recovery of Arianna. The media coverage, well, Arianna and Nikki weren't making national headlines, and their story would have likely gone unnoticed if not for the unusual circumstances surrounding the story: a murdered mom and a missing toddler. Either one of those cases, independent of each other, would have gone largely unnoticed. But together, it was garnering a decent amount of local coverage. But remember, I mentioned that the San Francisco Police Department was becoming embroiled in some controversial officer-involved shootings that was leading to the calls for the police chief's resignation. Well, the day after this press conference with the reward and the plywood, that's exactly what the police chief did. He resigned the very next day. And suddenly, all the media attention was drawn away from Arianna and Nikki and focused in on the police violence within the San Francisco Police Department. And it's pretty much been that way ever since. Police had another press conference almost a year after Nikki's death to inform the media that they searched a car that they think belonged to Helena Hearn. They also said that they've executed search warrants not only in California, but in surrounding states, but they would not say where. Following that, they announced that they've made, quote, unbelievable strides in the case, unquote. But that was it. Still keeping information close to the vest, 2017 was the last time the San Francisco Police Department publicly addressed Nikki's and Arianna's case. Nikki Fitts was cremated and her ashes, contained in an urn made of salt, was placed into the water off the coast of Marina del Rey. Today, Nikki's murder and Arianna's disappearance remain unsolved. So, what happened to Arianna Fitts? Well, let's go through some theories. There is a Reddit thread, so I'll go over a couple I found in there. Some of the posts on Reddit opined that Arianna is no longer alive and that she likely died or was killed as a result of abuse or neglect by both or one of the Hearn sisters. I should quickly point out that Helena's maiden name is Hearn, but her married name is Helena Martin, in case you go looking around and see her referred to by one or both of these names. The theory went on to say that the Hearn sisters may have been disgruntled over Nikki's inability to pay them for childcare and held on to Arianna until Nikki came up with the money that she owed. And they may have even been demanding more money than Nikki actually owed them, but were using Arianna as leverage against her. There have been reports that Nikki was told that she wasn't going to get her daughter back until she paid them off. So this might explain the $600 that she withdrew the evening before she went missing. This may have been the payment, possibly a ransom, because that is technically what we have here, but Nikki may not have realized that she could have gone to the police for help. But then again, she may have been told to not involve police or else they would harm Arianna. It's a very helpless place for Nikki to find herself in. The fear of going to the police is very real here. Nikki may have been under the impression that she was doing something terribly wrong, that perhaps she was the neglectful one when it came to Arianna's well-being. She'd already had one child removed from her custody. She was probably afraid of losing Arianna too. Not to mention an overall distrust of the police to begin with, based on what we've heard going on with the San Francisco Police Department at the time. In the Reddit post, it was also stated, as I said earlier in the episode, that the trip to Disneyland is highly unlikely. I figured that it was a stalling tactic, but there is a theory that this possible Disneyland ruse was a cover-up for the time surrounding Arianna's death. If these sisters were being so petty and demanding that Nikki pay them all this money for babysitting, trying to squeeze money from a woman who is barely keeping her head above water, are they really going to have the kinds of money to take a trip to Disneyland? And was there ever any proof that they ever showed up at Disneyland? Were there ever any social media posts? I don't even know if anyone even investigated to check to see if tickets were purchased, if they reserved a hotel. Nothing about the Disneyland story really makes any sense at all. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Disneyland didn't happen. If Arianna is no longer alive, then it leaves us wondering this. Did she die before Nikki died, or did she die afterwards? If Arianna died at the same time as Nikki, isn't it likely that they would have been left together under that piece of plywood? If Arianna was dead prior to Nikki's death, then it is likely that Nikki was killed in order to prevent her from reporting Arianna's disappearance to police. It seems as though whomever had Arianna was attempting to keep Nikki at bay for as long as possible while they figured out what their next move was going to be. So, say Arianna died in their care, likely of abuse or neglect, or they just flat out murdered her, though I'm not sure what the motive would be there. They hatched this plan to not only get rid of Nikki to cover their tracks, but to also lure her over under the guise of getting her daughter back in exchange for payment. And Nikki is thinking, okay, great, this is going to be over with. I can get my daughter returned to me. I can always earn back this money. And she went to meet with the babysitter that night with the intentions of paying them off, getting Arianna, and moving on. But she was ambushed instead. She never got her daughter. They took her money, and then they took her life. I do not believe Nikki's cause of death has been released to the public. And because she was found in a fetal position, it had me thinking that when she was placed in that shallow grave, that she was still alive and curled up in order to comfort herself. And whatever injuries that she had, she succumbed to sometime the night of April 1st, going into the 2nd. Then there's the possibility that Arianna is alive, but where could she be? There was no trace of Arianna when the homes of Helena and Ciolo were searched. Is there the possibility that one or both of them wanted to keep Arianna and raise her as their own? It's not unheard of, but again, we have to ask, where is she? Because Arianna has not been spotted at all in the 2.5 years since this all began unfolding. Could they have stashed her with someone else? It's possible, but what are the chances someone is going to be willing to hide a human being for this long? Nothing has been ruled out because we simply have no idea where Arianna is today. I'd also like to know what, if anything, the police have done to investigate the Hearn sisters any further. The phone records should have indicated who it was that made that last phone call to Nikki, the one that lured her out for a meeting at a nearby restaurant, a meeting that she never returned from. And then the text message being sent from Nikki's phone to her roommate Goyette's phone telling her that she was going to Fresno with Sam? Where was her phone pinging that night? And is anybody else's phone pinging alongside her phone in the area? Like maybe Helena's or Ciolo's? Was that ever looked into? And from where or what IP address was that Facebook message about spending time with her 3-year-old and needing this break was made from? What computer was that message posted from? If the police department tracked down any of the digital information, they haven't said, but I sure hope that they looked into that angle. As for the Hearn sisters, what's their story been? Well, all police would say is that they are uncooperative and inconsistent, or they simply could have told police that they turned Arianna over to Nikki and haven't seen either one of them since the last time they were hired to babysit. And that's their story, and they're sticking to it, and the San Francisco Police Department have gotten no further than that. Arianna Fitts was born September 6, 2013. If alive today, she would be 6 years old. At the time she went missing, she was 2 feet tall and weighed 45 pounds. Arianna is African American with black curly hair and brown eyes. She is listed on the charlieproject.org as missing and endangered. If anyone sees Arianna Fitts, call 911 immediately. If you have information on Arianna's whereabouts or anything related to the homicide of Nikki, contact the San Francisco Police Homicide Unit at area code 415-553-1145. The San Francisco Police Department's anonymous tip line is 415-575-4444, or text a tip to tip 411 with SFPD at the beginning of the text message, or visit sanfranciscopolice.org/tip. For further reading, you can search the San Francisco Weekly article, Where is Arianna Fitts?, written by Nuala Sawyer Bishari, who is the news editor for San Francisco Weekly, who published this article on July 26, 2018. Thank you so much for listening to this bonus episode of California Dreaming. I will post pictures of Arianna for you on our social media platforms. And until next time, sweet dreams.